King Charles III set the signed document down on the polished surface of the private desk and did not speak. The silence that followed carried more authority than any formal announcement. 2 minutes earlier, a closed letter had left Buckingham Palace, ending the last formal avenue Meghan Markle had sought to keep open. What she had framed as a measured request for limited ceremonial recognition, controlled security arrangements, and a carefully restricted return to certain official duties was now permanently refused. Officials inside the institution later described the moment as the point at which every remaining pathway was closed. The decision was not presented as punishment. It was recorded as controlled closure, an administrative act designed to protect the structure of the monarchy from further exposure. Meghan Markle submitted her appeal through the established official channels rather than any attempt at personal conversation. The correspondence was carefully composed, its language precise and deliberately restrained. She requested the restoration of limited royal honors, a formal ceremonial connection that would allow her presence at selected events, state-level security arrangements that had once been standard, and a narrowly defined framework under which she might resume participation in certain official duties. Each element of the request was presented as provisional and subject to whatever new conditions the institution might impose. The letters traveled the proper routes, arriving on desks that had grown unaccustomed to receiving such submissions. Those who examined the papers understood at once that the substance of the ask extended beyond personal preference and touched the operating principles of the monarchy itself. The documents carried the measured tone of someone who had once lived inside the system and now stood firmly outside it, seeking a controlled and limited return rather than full reinstatement. Every sentence had been weighed for its possible interpretation, every phrase chosen to avoid the appearance of demand. Yet the very act of writing through formal channels rather than seeking a private audience already signaled how distant the relationship had become. The palace received the papers, logged them according to protocol, and began the quiet internal process of determining whether any portion of the request could ever be granted without compromising the structure that had to remain intact. Inside the private meeting room, the atmosphere remained still and heavy. A senior aide read the formal rejection aloud in a voice kept deliberately level, almost flat, as though any inflection might risk revealing the finality of the words. No one present mistook the calm delivery for uncertainty. Within minutes, the palace computer systems marked the decision as irreversible. Every negotiation route that had once remained open under conditional review was closed by protocols that no advisor could override. Quiet alerts moved across connected departments, not as signals of disorder, but as confirmation that an administrative step of permanent consequence had been completed. King Charles stood for a time at the tall window overlooking the gardens, his back to the room, before turning away without looking at the file again. The silence that followed the reading of the rejection was not empty. It carried the accumulated weight of earlier conversations, earlier warnings, and earlier moments when the possibility of limited reconciliation had still been discussed in careful language. Those in the room understood that the decision had already moved beyond debate. The institutional machinery had absorbed the choice and begun to enforce it through ordinary procedures that now carried extraordinary finality. No one spoke of punishment. The language used was that of controlled closure, of ending remaining official pathways, of protecting the monarchy from further exposure to risk that could not be measured or contained. King Charles carried the dual responsibility of institutional continuity and personal history. He understood with absolute clarity that even a limited affirmation of Meghan's request could alter the practical boundaries of privilege, protection, and ceremonial participation for years, perhaps decades ahead. The choice was therefore removed from broader advisory consultation, an unusual departure from standard procedure that underlined the weight attached to the outcome. Those closest to him later observed a subtle but unmistakable shift in his manner, a change that suggested the decision had already moved beyond the immediate case and into the wider pattern of how the monarchy would handle similar matters in future. He did not raise his voice or display anger. Instead, he allowed the formal process to proceed under the quiet authority of his presence. The papers before him represented more than one woman's request. They represented a test of whether the institution could still draw a firm line when personal ties and public perception pulled in opposite directions. Charles accepted that the cost of the decision would be borne in private as well as in public, yet he judged that the alternative, reopening pathways that had already proved destabilizing, carried greater risk to the structure he was sworn to preserve. The silence he maintained after signing was not hesitation. It was the recognition that the matter had left the realm of discussion discussion and entered the realm of irreversible record. Prince William reviewed the evolving meeting notes in complete silence. His expression tightened as he measured the long-term implications for the formal limits of the family and the crown. He recognized that a final refusal would harden institutional boundaries in ways that could not easily be softened later, establishing a precedent that future generations would inherit. The quiet around him was not empty. It reflected an understanding that the structure itself was being redefined by the act of closure. William did not interrupt the process or seek to reopen debate. He observed it with the disciplined attention of someone who already understood that any further discussion would change nothing already set in motion by higher authority and institutional necessity. His earlier silence during previous meetings now appeared in a different light. Not detachment, but the careful calculation of a man who knew that the monarchy's survival depended on clear edges rather than open-ended negotiation. The papers on the table before him were not merely administrative. They were the visible evidence of a shift in how power, privilege, and protection would be allocated from this point forward. William absorbed the information without comment, aware that his own future role would be shaped by the firmness of the line being drawn. The decisive shift had begun earlier, in a closed royal meeting that never reached public record and was never intended to. Meghan's most recent proposal was placed on the table and immediately met with firm resistance from senior aides. They argued that any partial restoration of ceremonial access and security clearance conflicted directly with the established rules of duty, order, and permission that governed the institution. Documents covering clearance levels, media contact protocols, and financial parameters were examined in careful sequence. Each page narrowed the space between the possibility of limited return and the necessity of refusal. King Charles listened without interruption, his face tightening as the formal language of the proposal was read aloud. Prince William remained still, already sensing that reopening talks could weaken trust that was already under considerable strain. One senior figure entered a single line into the official record that day. "This cannot proceed in any revised form." That sentence later appeared in multiple internal notes and quietly shaped the final institutional position. The meeting ended without raised voices or dramatic declarations. Yet from that moment, the direction of every subsequent discussion was set. The room had grown colder, not because of any personal animosity, but because the collective judgment of those responsible for the monarchy's continuity had moved against further negotiation. Before the formal rejection was issued, every figure connected to the matter carried unspoken pressure. Meghan waited in a quiet room, her telephone face down on the table, aware that continued silence from the palace constituted a form of judgment delivered without dialogue. The weight of not knowing grew heavier with each passing hour, because the absence of an answer already signaled the probable outcome. King Charles held the institutional requirement to preserve stability against the background of family history that could not be entirely set aside. He understood that the decision, once recorded, would define not only the present relationship but the practical boundaries of future ones. Prince William studied the evolving papers and recognized that the answer, once given, would redefine the edges of royal authority in ways that would outlast any single generation. Delays in the transmission of internal messages that did not match ordinary procedure suggested that information was being held under tighter control than usual. Timing itself had become part of the decision. Senior aides moved with unusual care, aware that every step was being watched by colleagues who understood the significance of what was unfolding. The pressure was not dramatic. It was the steady, cumulative weight of an institution preparing to close a chapter it had once left partially open. In a restricted corridor, away from aides, cameras, and formal settings, King Charles and Prince William stood together for a brief exchange that carried more consequence than many longer meetings. There were no documents between them this time, only the shared understanding of what had already been decided. The conversation remained low and measured. Both men articulated the same conclusion in different words. The door could not be opened again. Exhaustion was visible in the pauses Charles allowed between sentences, the cost of a decision that had moved from institutional necessity into personal finality. William's reply contained no challenge and no attempt to reopen the question. It contained only recognition that the administrative machinery of the monarchy had already moved past discussion. What remained was acceptance that the relationship with Meghan had crossed a boundary the institution was prepared to defend without further negotiation. The quiet that followed their brief exchange was not empty. It was loaded with the knowledge that the choice had already escaped their immediate control and entered the permanent record of the crown. Neither man raised his voice. Neither needed to. The finality of the moment required no emphasis. With Within the administrative core of the palace, the matter was never treated as an emotional response. It was examined as a structural requirement. Senior figures gathered around classified notes that set out risk assessments, earlier decisions, and the long-term need for institutional stability. Meghan's request was analyzed line by line against ceremonial roles, symbolic authority, and public perception. Even a limited restoration of privileges was judged capable of introducing instability into the wider framework that the monarchy depended upon. One official stated quietly that reopening the file would not restore equilibrium. It would weaken the system that had to remain intact if the institution were to continue functioning with public confidence. King Charles remained present but largely silent, allowing the institutional logic to proceed under the quiet authority of his presence. The language used in the room was precise and free of drama. Every word carried the weight of irreversible consequence. Those present understood that the stability of the crown was being weighed against any remaining possibility of flexibility, and that the balance had already tipped. Personal history, however significant, could not override the structural requirements of an institution that measured its survival in centuries rather than individual relationships. When the confirmation was finally transmitted, the classification assigned to the decision was absolute, finalized with no review path permitted. The language of the administrative entry was dry and precise, yet its effect removed every remaining possibility of reconsideration, appeal, or reinterpretation under any internal process. A formal message was prepared for entry into the permanent royal record. The room grew still as the transmission was completed. Those present understood that the act converted human judgment into irreversible institutional fact. No individual authority, however senior, could reverse it once filed. King Charles did not react visibly. Those around him recognized that his silence was not distance, but acceptance of a structure already locked into motion. The helper who moved the final confirmation into the system did so with deliberate care, aware that the single act of filing would close an entire working chapter. Once the entry was made, there was no longer debate. There were only the consequences that would now unfold according to the ordinary procedures of an institution that had chosen clarity over continued negotiation. Meghan Markle received the confirmation through official message channels rather than personal contact. The distance between the individual and the institution felt deliberate and absolute. The message contained no ceremony, no explanatory softening, and nothing that might invite further discussion. She read it once and remained still. The shift from residual hope to controlled recognition of finality settled without outward display, as though her mind were adjusting to a reality that refused to match the future she had still allowed herself to imagine. Inside the palace, a senior aide responsible for the transmission stepped away from his desk for several moments, the weight of what had just been recorded registering in silence rather than words. He understood that what had been confirmed was not merely a rejection of one request, but the formal closing of an entire pathway that had once remained conditionally open. The message itself was brief. Its implications were not. Every remaining channel related to restoration was now frozen. The institutional record had been updated in real time, closing off possibilities that had previously stayed under review. Outside the controlled walls of the palace, the first subtle irregularities in message timing began to attract notice, early signals that something of consequence had occurred behind closed doors. Later, King Charles and Prince William met again, this time without papers, without formal structure, and without the presence of aides. The rejection had already become recorded history inside the system. William entered first, his expression tight with restraint rather than resistance. Charles followed more slowly, carrying a quiet that felt heavier than authority itself. There was no remaining argument to be had. Both men understood that the institutional mechanisms were now enforcing the outcome automatically, running the established rules without further human reconsideration. Charles spoke first, not with instruction or command, but with a recognition that the matter had moved beyond their immediate control. William listened without interruption. The shared understanding between them was not disagreement. It was the knowledge that a once open possibility had been closed permanently, and that neither of them possessed the authority to reverse what the institution had already absorbed into its permanent record. The emotional weight of the moment was not dramatic. It was the quiet acceptance of finality that had already taken institutional form. All remaining internal pathways related to any form of restoration were frozen. Records updated themselves in real time, closing channels that had previously stayed open under conditional review. The decision was formally embedded in the Royal Administrative Archive as irreversible. No further requests would be considered under the governing protocols that now protected the closure from any attempt at reopening. King Charles accepted the emotional cost of a choice that could not be lightened by good intention or altered by regret. Inside the monarchy, such moments are measured only in terms of continuity and consequence. Meghan's position relative to the institution was no longer open to discussion. The absence of any further communication became the statement itself. Prince William stood apart, assessing the permanence of the boundaries now reinforced by the decision. He understood that what had been closed was not simply one case, but a precedent for the handling of future matters without exception. The framework of the monarchy had solidified through resolution rather than confrontation, and that clarity left no residual flexibility behind. As the information moved beyond the palace walls, headlines formed with unusual speed across global media. One major British newspaper carried a stark front-page declaration that the final door had been closed at the palace. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, crowds began to gather, while broadcasters framed the development as a historic break in royal relations. Live anchors paused mid-report, selecting language with unusual care before describing the decision as the most definitive rejection in recent memory. The institution that had long controlled the timing of its own narratives now found itself responding to a story already in motion. Cameras focused on every shift in security positioning around the entrances, turning routine operational adjustments into symbols of tension. What had begun as a sealed internal confirmation became a worldwide focal point within hours. The palace no longer spoke first, it was spoken about. In that reversal, the established pattern of royal communication entered unfamiliar territory. Outside the gates, the public response was varied and immediate. Some stood in silence, others expressed open shock. A smaller number voiced clear support for the institution's right to maintain firm boundaries. Reporters worked to separate observation from interpretation while the volume of coverage increased by the hour. King Charles did not watch the broadcasts directly, yet the weight of external interpretation had already moved past the reach of internal meeting rooms. Prince William, though not present at the gates, became part of the narrative forming in real time. Meghan's name circulated across discussion programs, now fully detached from private correspondence and absorbed into broader accounts of separation and finality. The emotional landscape outside the palace was fractured, reflecting the different ways the public measured loyalty, duty, and the right of an institution to protect its own structure. The coverage continued without pause, each new segment adding another layer of interpretation to a decision that had already been made and recorded. Global networks layered analysis, speculation, and reaction over the same core facts. Interpretations expanded rapidly, stretching further from the original administrative act with every passing hour. What had begun as a sealed internal confirmation became a focal point reshaped by public perception, political commentary, and emotional response. The palace watched the coverage in silence, recognizing that control over the public account had already passed outside its walls. Security adjustments around the entrances, once routine and unnoticed, were filmed and treated as evidence of tension. Meghan's name continued to circulate, now fully removed from the private letters that had initiated the process and absorbed into narratives of finality and institutional separation. King Charles was discussed in terms of institutional resolve. Prince William was referenced in analyses of future boundaries. The original decision remained unchanged by any of the external commentary. It had already been locked into the permanent record. The public conversation, however, had taken on a life of its own, moving according to its own logic and its own momentum. In the quiet that followed the public reaction, King Charles lowered his gaze in private, accepting the personal cost attached to an institutional necessity. He did not speak of victory or loss, because inside the monarchy such terms do not exist in isolation. There is only continuity and consequence. Meghan's position relative to the institution was no longer open to discussion. The absence of any further communication became the statement itself. No interview, official account, or recorded reflection was required to explain it further. Prince William stood apart, assessing the permanence of the boundaries now reinforced. He understood that the closure established a precedent for the handling of future matters without exception. That knowledge carried its own quiet weight, because it meant the structure of the monarchy had shifted not through open confrontation, but through a resolution that left no flexibility behind. Even without raised voices or public declarations, the framework had hardened into clarity, and that clarity was absolute. The decision strengthened the formal limits of the institution. Staying intact now required defined edges rather than open-ended negotiation. Internal understanding was consistent across the relevant offices. A royal chapter had had been closed without ceremony or public declaration, sealed instead by irreversible administrative alignment. What remained was not uncertainty, but structure that was deliberate, unmoving, and final. The monarchy had demonstrated both what it chose to protect and what it was no longer prepared to reopen, regardless of who stood on the other side of the closed door. The systems that manage communication, security considerations, and formal correspondence now treated the matter as permanently concluded. No pathway remained for reconsideration. The weight of the decision continued to register across the offices that implemented it, yet the outcome itself was no longer subject to internal debate. Clarity had replaced the earlier ambiguity, and the institution accepted the cost of that clarity as the price of continued stability. From this point forward, the operating principles of the Crown placed institutional stability above any attempt at reconciliation that might compromise those principles. The systems that manage the daily work of the monarchy now treat the matter as permanently closed. No further requests will be considered under the protocols that protect the decision from reopening. King Charles carries the decision as both sovereign and father. Prince William carries the knowledge that the structure he will one day inherit has drawn a line it intends to maintain. The practical boundaries of privilege, protection, and ceremonial participation have been clarified in ways that will outlast the present generation. The monarchy that emerges from this moment is more structurally rigid than before, prioritizing defined limits over open discussion. The internal understanding is clear and consistent. Stability now requires edges that do not shift according to personal history or public pressure. The institution has chosen continuity over flexibility, and that choice has been recorded in terms that cannot be altered. The letter has left the palace. The systems have recorded the refusal. The public has begun to absorb the consequences. Inside the walls of the institution, the daily work of the monarchy continues under boundaries more clearly drawn than they were only days earlier. Meghan Markle's final formal request has been answered with permanent administrative silence. King Charles carries the decision as both sovereign and father. Prince William carries the knowledge that the structure he will one day inherit has drawn a line it intends to keep. Nothing in the official record suggests any route back. The story that began with sealed correspondence and quiet meetings has ended with a door the institution will not open again. The consequences will continue to unfold in public view, shaped by commentary and reaction that the palace can no longer control. Yet the choice itself remains locked where it was made, final, complete, and irreversible. The chapter is closed. The record is permanent. The monarchy moves forward under the clearer limits it has chosen to enforce.